Hello there, how are you doing?
Hi. All good, thank you. How are you?
I'm doing okay. It's amazing it's already Tuesday.
Yeah, well, Tuesday hits earlier for you than it does for me. So,
Oh, that's true. Yes.
yeah.
Uh, yeah, we've actually been having some interesting rumblings, new conformances, I think, on the back of increased engagement from companies across China like Huawei. So I think we're going to have a busy month, even though I know everyone is going on vacation.
Yeah, excellent. Excellent.
So I'm displaying the antitrust policy notice as always, and if anyone has any questions, they can find the full antitrust policy notice on the website. If you represent a Linux Foundation member company, you can, of course, talk to our counsel, Andy Updegrove, on the subject. We're going to have a bit of an unusual call today. That's because we're going to have a bit of a special preview of something that has been cooked up inside the Linux Foundation. I've been working with David Wheeler and Kate Stewart on various things around supply chain integrity. And one of the items that has come up is a set of presentation slides that will be used at various events across the year with some slight adjustments. I'm going to give you a preview of the slides from the QCon Plus event, which is scheduled for the Q4 part of this year. And the reason I'm going to give you a preview of these slides is because the OpenChain security guidance document goes live next week on the 12th of August. So from next week, there'll be an official document to describe how to use OpenChain in the context of security. Because of that, I think it's time to show you how security is being framed in the context of supply chains with some high-level discussions. Now, bear in mind, these slides are one of several versions of sets out there that are being prepared. This is a preview of something for a forthcoming event. It may be adjusted, but it gives you a good idea of where we're at right now with regards supply chain integrity. So David wanted to start with the general thing saying open source is everywhere and so on and so forth. And the reason is working with various organizations like NASA indicates that while they use a lot of open source, not all departments are fully cognizant of the extent to which open source is used and the implications of that. This includes things like license discussions. It includes the thing of whether open source is potentially related to shareware and so on and so forth. It's the whole base of the discussion. The key point that we want to make for organizations that might have silos with different understandings of open source is quite simply that the percentages are huge. So I think that 98% of general code bases containing open source is not a huge surprise, but it is an actual data point now because of Synopsys. This is what they see globally from all the various customers they have. And bear in mind, Synopsys is far more than Black Duck. They also have security solutions. Indeed, it's the security part of Synopsys which became an OpenChain partner. So with 528 OS libraries per analyzed code base, you get an idea of how important containment is in the supply chain. Another point we had from Sonatype was double and triple digit growth in open source ecosystems. So essentially those numbers from Synopsys are only the beginning of what's coming next. All, of course, is not happiness out there. Though we have seen some serious issues with attacks on open source as well as proprietary software. Some of the interesting open source attacks came through things like key encryption being broken, and some of the interesting proprietary attacks included someone compromising the entire build system. These are something we need to address, and we're working out ways to do that in a coherent manner. The question of whether open source or proprietary is more secure is answered by the data very simply, neither. The problems and solutions exist across the types of software. Open source has a potential security advantage, but it has no inherent security advantage. And that has a grievous effect on how you address it. Any party that thought that open source is better because it's open source is operating incorrectly under security. Likewise, any party who thought proprietary software is better than open source is operating under an incorrect assumption as well. So what we need then are methodologies of review. And ultimately, what we have is an architecture problem. And this is something that we have not solved adequately in the global scene yet. And it's leading to the proliferation of attacks we've seen in the last 18 months or more. Partly that's not because the attacks are new, it's because they're being publicized more by the media, but partly it's also because at the moment, the ways that software in general can be compromised versus the way that software is prepared and deployed is increasingly obvious to hostile actors as useful to generate code that will undermine it and generate money for them. Now I'm going to hit the present button because a few of the slides might need changing. Can you see this presentation at the moment?
Yep, looks good to me.
All right. So when it comes to what's happening right now, we have some issues with updates being probably the most problematic thing in the world. Again, we're going to data because that's obviously what we need. 84% of code bases had at least one open source component with a vulnerability. And on average, they had 158 vulnerabilities per code base. So, we're looking at a significant attack vector. The average vulnerability age is 2.2 years, which indicates the scale of security architecture that's not in place. So 63% of Android apps have known vulnerabilities in open source, 44% have high risk vulnerabilities. And of course, we have some specific numbers that came up, like the Lodash vulnerability, which was fixed in 2019, but still prevalent in 29% of code bases in 2020. Maybe the most concerning thing, even though this entire slide is concerning, is the final point from Synopsys that 85% of code bases have dependencies out of date. And what that means is that for all of the very difficult numbers that we have there about known vulnerabilities, code that's 4 years out of date will have unknown vulnerabilities. So the door is still wide open, even if you fix the above. So that's really something to chew on, and we don't talk about that enough as an industry. I'll move to the next slide. When you map out how this stuff is happening and why it's happening, it's possible to get a real feeling for what is the supply chain and what type of integrity does it need. So looking at what we've got here, we have the workflow, and I'll be sharing this with you for later. This workflow takes existing supply chain integrity maps. It takes quite a few from many different sources and simplifies them down to what we could find minimum to describe what we have to do for software. And what we can see then, moving on to the next slide, assuming everything works well, is that we have a bunch of sample attacks under these different types of labels. This is mostly what happens in these places. And each of these items can be addressed with processes. The processes to address each of these items are certain actions that are well known. It's not like all of these security issues are where we have to reinvent the wheel. We can address each specific area with specific actions. I'll be sending you 3 versions of this slide, the bare one, the one with the threats, and the one with the resolutions. From our take, if people take these actions, if they do this stuff, the security vectors are dramatically improved. What we saw on the last slide with all of those numbers was extremely worrying. But if we can do this stuff, include it in our processes, the worry is dramatically reduced. So David Wheeler made a very good point about this. What we have now is a whole bunch of problems and a whole bunch of solutions. And obviously, it's impossible to go from all the problems to all the solutions. not just at once, but perhaps ever. So we have to focus on what we can fix today. David identified certain actions that he thinks will do significant positive benefit to the ecosystem. One is incredibly simple, learning to develop and acquire secure software. But it's something that most companies don't train. They don't actually formally train people to do this. People have institutional knowledge and so on and so forth. There is actually a course which teaches people how to do this, and it's available for free on edX. It would be surprisingly effective if we could get more people to take this course. The second thing, which is also very much related to Linux Foundation, is the CII Best Practices badge. As you may or may not be familiar, this badge basically checks off the best practices of a project to make sure that they have the correct processes in place for long-term management. And in doing so, that's what really helps fix a lot of those attack vectors of neglected code, mistaken architecture, badly trained people. Then we have the thing of using tools to look for vulnerabilities. People often spend more energy on optimization than security. They spend more energy on occasion on license compliance than security. It's vital that people incorporate security tools into what they're doing. And there's a guide available online indicating what types of tooling is useful and what you can deploy to solve the biggest vectors right away. Obviously, monitoring for vulnerabilities is important, and rapid updates are important too. These are two areas where, in essence, companies tend to underinvest. People don't keep checking on the vulnerabilities, and when updates are needed, it's often a case of going back and working out how to do it, rather than it being something you can just push. Then we've got something that he put down, which is interesting because it's actually one of the biggest attack vectors, which we should look at. Evaluate before selecting software to use. He mentions typo squatting. And what's interesting with typo squatting is that over 60% of open source vulnerabilities are typo squatting. In other words, someone makes a tiny change to a URL used to do a specific action, check an update, do something else. And that's what pulls in something hostile. So, these courses, I'm not going to go into detail. Basically, you've got 1.5 days of training to get a serious amount of security education there regarding architecture, implementation, and then specialized topics. As always, these things are very easy for you to do through LF. There's very little to do except put in your name, email address, and off you go. The CII Best Practices badge, more detail is here. You'll obviously be getting these slides later, so I won't read it out. But in short, it might seem like a bit of a pain to use to start with when you look at it first, if you have a project that doesn't do anything with regard to architecture or process management. But it's perfectly possible to do so. There's a lot of projects participating. So over 500 projects are in the passing stage. Another 3,700 are engaging. And it really does close off the developmental process holes. Yeah. So when it came to evaluating risk and so on, we had a few notes. And these notes are probably not significant to you or your immediate audience because you're sophisticated in open source, but they're well worth having for any party that you engage with that's looking at open source. Just 6 points. Evidence that the project is worked and made secure. Is it easy to use securely? Is it maintained? Does it have significant use? What's the license? What is your own evaluation? And then did you download it securely? Out of these, there were probably 3 things that I point out as serious issues in the market. First one, do the developers work to make it secure? Any project that emphasizes features over security architecture is unsafe. You need to contain it. Then there's the point, does it have significant use? If something looks wonderful but doesn't have a large community, one of the particular benefits of open source has been lost, which is many eyes. And then finally, I'd say downloaded securely is increasingly a problem. We're seeing attacks where you might have just seen the other day, one of the online repositories was compromised. We're seeing attacks where the software itself is basically fine, but someone manages to either maliciously take over the main project's download or take over an ancillary download location and give you a compromised version of the software. Those are three of the big things that we really see hitting. Obviously, OpenChain essentially addresses most of this, and that's one thing that, next week onwards, OpenChain is taking global leadership in this because we have such a large community. So if people are using the OpenChain processes, they should be able to accomplish all the goals previously mentioned. There's the thing then, what is your evaluation, which is outside of OpenChain? This is the specific process that you should do. The answer is interesting. If you talk to security giants, they will talk about incredibly intricate evaluation processes for software for security. But as we have found from the numbers, and David's certainly done a lot of research here, you don't have to do incredibly in-depth reviews to get solid insight of generally how are things going. If the process for development includes security, validation of what's going on, if the approach to the software includes being aware of vulnerabilities of things like dependencies, again, you're closing off massive amounts of vectors for attack. If you know how the software is built, ideally, if you can reproduce the build perfectly, then you know that something like the injection attack at SolarWinds is not happening. If you can do a few of these things, the attack vectors collapse dramatically, and you're moving towards edge cases. Now, if you want really, really secure software, you can pay an organization for an in-depth analysis. But if you do just a few things, you will make a dramatic impact. Like I said, most of what happens with open source is actually typo squatting, over 60%. Right, this is where David got really geeky. He's just showing a few of the things that have happened that were interesting as security actions. So the resilience of repositories to attack, with various ways of people attacking Linux or SourceForge, Apache, Debian, he's just describing how the attacks are caught. And in the case of these attacks, essentially it's people look at the code, they're doing a security review. Sometimes it's too late, you have to go back and solve it, which is what happened recently with Linux, with the university sending intentionally vulnerable code into the kernel. As soon as it was identified, the code was of course removed and the university was booted from the kernel. It wasn't a catch before, but it certainly was a as soon as caught fixed. And of course we have, the question of how people might use a backdoor in build systems and other similar things. So here we have example of Borland. They had an interesting problem where they had a password which was just left hard-coded in a proprietary project for 7 years. And when they released it as open source, because of actual developer review for security, it was found in 5 months. Examples. Okay, so we're going to talk very, very briefly on the install problem. I've mentioned typo squatting, which is an issue. The other is the availability of software. You may have noticed increasingly when you download software, you're given options for downloading it. You're given mirrors. Sometimes you're sent to another website. It could be something like Cloudflare that's backing up cached copies of it. That kind of stuff is convenient, but problematic. You need to have from the main site, from something like an encrypted connection like HTTPS, and you need to be very careful if you get it from anywhere else, including an apparently trustworthy location. This I bring up because downloading is less and less transparent. And if you had a situation, just as an example, where you download a piece of code that offers to install other code to get something done. Let's say it's on Linux and it offers to install Wine so it can execute something for you. That's what you should not do. you should obtain wine from its actual original location and run it there. But unfortunately, that's not what people are doing in practice. They're downloading code from where it's convenient, and they're opening up incredible attack vectors. This process management is not really relevant for us to get into in any detail, but basically the detection and respond in dealing with attacks is critical. Protection itself is not greatly relevant. I mean, it's okay, but the detection and response is critical because mostly what's happening is something that you're not protected against. People evolve attacks rapidly. We have quite a lot of work around the ecosystem, monitoring for vulnerabilities. So GitHub, GitLab, Linux Foundation's LFX tools are all doing that. If you use GitHub nowadays, you're probably used to constant little pings from Dependabot telling you when there's updates to code available and flagging security. And of course, when vulnerabilities are found, you need to analyze what's going on there to determine response. And this means right away. This means as soon as possible. It can't be something that's on the back burner for Thursday's meeting. It just can't, because that's the time when something happens. Now, David had a few best guesses on where we're going next. He thinks that we'll have more help evaluating open source, and that's actually a certainty because that's us. OpenSSF and Chaos will be doing a lot of work to help with the metrics and analysis. So when it comes down to, is this software okay? Has it been compromised? Is there something that we need to do before Thursday's meeting? That's coming right in. Software bill of materials, you obviously know, is being addressed. We have package managers already doing this in single ecosystems, but things like SPDX are going to be global solutions. SPDX 2.2 is probably going to be published this week. Its status is under publication in ISO, so it's coming right out. You may or may not be familiar with digital bill of materials. This is where it's covering everything, hardware and software. That's still in its early stages, but there's more and more work to address the comprehensive digital bill of materials, and it's almost assured that Linux Foundation will be at the core of that. We have some things that are pretty obvious that should be on the radar. One thing is to use cryptographic signature verification in consistent ways. And that's really what SigStore is about. If you're not familiar with the SigStore project, it's probably something you should get familiar with. Again, we're looking at how do we address this in a global manner, not just in a single ecosystem. And SigStore is part of that. And then we've got things like integritization with Intoto and others, which are able to help you work out if the integrity is looking good. And finally, there's a point I'd like to just flag. 7, increased use of memory-safe languages. This is actually going to have a huge impact because a memory overflow is by far the most common vector we have. And things like Rust entering the Linux kernel are huge. Right, the metrics from OpenSSF are really easy to use. If you're familiar with using any of the proprietary tools or anything like that, you'll see that this is nice and clean and very familiar conceptually to you. This again is easily available, it's freely available, and it can help you understand precisely where projects are at with regards to the quality of their code from a security optic and the quality of their processes from a security optic. Reproducible bills is way up on the radar nowadays, of course. We're still waiting for the magic ingredient to reproducible bills. There is a project, reproduciblebills.org, and there are guidance documents talking about this, like we have a blog on Linux Foundation from David going into great detail. We're probably still waiting on a global solution to reproducibility. Debian is probably furthest ahead with 94% reproducible as of April. Once we have the automated systems for reproducibility, it will be wise of everyone to adopt them. In the meantime, to know that reproducible is important, and where possible, use something like SigStore to see if what you have and what you can build is the same as what they have and they would give you. Now, David was very clear from his review of the ecosystem that our belief, our hunch that SPDX is critical to all of this is indeed true. And also, of course, that the ecosystem itself is a little bit behind on software bill of materials. It still feels a little bit too new for the community in that they don't yet have full awareness around the world of the necessity of cross-domain software bill of materials. The security shock from SolarWinds and elsewhere has changed that. We now have everyone becoming aware that we need this solution, and SPDX is where everyone is coalescing, which is good, and it certainly benefits the OpenChain project. Moving to the next slide. We're not going to go into detail on memory-safe languages. Suffice to say, when you see Rust or another memory-safe language in use, it will be a lot more safe to use that code than C, C++, if the projects have equal security processes in place. And OpenSSF, you may not be fully familiar with this. It's relatively new. It came out last August. It's got 36 member companies in it right now. It is probably the center of where this discourse goes next, particularly regarding those global solutions, security SBOM, security DBOM, the processes required, CII best practices, and so on. And of course, talking about reproducibility, this is probably the best space to talk about whole ecosystem reproducibility over time. These are the projects in Linux Foundation alone working on this stuff right now. Okay, we've got a lot going on. If you want to keep up to speed with it, it's pretty simple though. OpenChain is at the heart of the discussion. So if you're in OpenChain, if you keep following what we're doing, we will always flag the main news. And our reference tooling group is probably at the forefront of how we automate all of this. You should definitely, though, look at OpenSSF and SigStore. These are 2 points where OpenSSF can help you with the processes and SigStore can help you with the implementation of dealing with whether code is secure or not, basically. And that's where I wrap up. I'm going to provide you with a copy of these slides later, but let's do a quick summary. The security vulnerabilities out there are brutal. Somewhere around 85% of the market in open source has security vulnerabilities, and that's mirrored in proprietary software. We have severe issues with people knowing what their software depends on, keeping track of the dependencies, and being capable, even if they do track a problem, of fixing it. Our recent spate of public announcements around security got attention, and it's very good, but they didn't come out of nowhere. It's just that this stuff has been happening for years without adequate attention. And things are accelerating now because computers are getting smart enough to do things like use AI to break into each other. We address this through process management. We know what we need to do, and we are putting in place the global tools to automate that so it's even easier. You would be wise to stay on the pulse of this because it's rapidly evolving, and what will be available in OpenSSF or SigStore in the Linux Foundation ecosystem will increase dramatically. Equally so, elsewhere, people are doing security in other domains. You should keep your eye on what is the Open Atom Foundation going to do in China. What will the Japanese cybersecurity team be releasing in the next few months? You'll be able to track all of that through OpenChain itself. It'll always be front and center. And that's where I wrap. If you've got any questions, happy to take them. As you can see, as the process management for security, our OpenChain security guidance document coming out on the 12th of August is likely to be in strong demand. And we will lean heavily on OpenSSF, SigStore, and in toto for guidance on implementation. If there's no questions, we can end there. But I do recommend that you should feel free, if you do have a question, to raise it now. Equally so, you can email us And if it's something that you want David Wheeler to address directly, he's on our lists and can be brought into the discussion at any time. Okay, thank you for your attention and time. I hope it was interesting to see where the briefings are going around the world. And I do hope to see you at the next webinar, which will be another interesting presentation from one of our partner companies.
That's really interesting. Thanks, Shane. Thanks, everyone.
Take care. Be well.
Okay, bye-bye.